A house, once filled with silence, is about to awaken to whispers that could change everything. A Marquis, broken in body and spirit, hides behind the walls of his manor, until a simple maid crosses his path and challenges the sorrow he wears like armor. But in a world ruled by titles and appearances, love can be the most dangerous rebellion of all. Beneath every glance lies a secret. Beneath every word, a choice between duty and desire. And when the truth comes to light, hearts will be tested in ways neither imagined. If you love emotional, dramatic period romances, subscribe now and help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers, so we can keep bringing these stories to life for you. The Cotswolds, England, 1814. The rain had begun before dawn, falling softly over the rolling green hills and the honey-coloured cottages of the Cotswolds. By mid-morning, the grey sky hung low, pressing its silence against the earth. At the edge of the village, Ashcombe Manor stood like a memory too proud to fade. Its windows were dark, its gates closed, its corridors filled with the kind of quiet that remembers laughter and waits in vain for it to return. Inside, servants moved as if the walls could hear their footsteps. Fires were lit, lamps trimmed, yet the air remained cold. The master of the house had come home at last, but his presence carried more shadow than light. Marquis Lawrence Ashcombe descended the staircase slowly, one hand gripping his cane, the other tracing the banister polished smooth by generations of his family. Each step was deliberate. The echo of the cane against stone reminded him of everything he had lost. The quick stride of youth, the ease of command, the admiration that once followed him like sunlight. When he reached the final step, Mrs. Elspeth Bracken appeared in the hall, sturdy and calm, her face as disciplined as her tone. "Good morning, my lord," she said, her curtsy precise. "Is there anything worth calling good in it?" he answered, his voice low, steady, but stripped of warmth. She hesitated before replying. "There is breakfast prepared in the east room, and the new maid has arrived from the village." Lawrence's jaw tightened. "Another one?" "Yes, my lord. The last girl gave notice yesterday." "Of course she did," he murmured, looking away. "No one wishes to serve a crippled master." He turned, the cane striking the floor as if to silence pity itself, and walked toward the east room. Mrs. Bracken exhaled softly, then signalled for the newcomer to step forward. Cecily Fairley obeyed. She was young, though her posture carried the quiet strength of someone accustomed to work. Her brown hair was drawn back beneath a white cap, her eyes steady and clear. The faint scent of soap clung to her hands, and the faintest trace of curiosity lingered in her expression as she took in the grandeur of the hall. "You'll address him as my lord. Keep your voice low and mind your manners," Mrs. Bracken instructed under her breath. "He's not one for conversation," Cecily nodded. "I'm not one for gossip, ma'am." Mrs. Bracken looked at her, surprised by the calm certainty in that reply, then gestured toward the breakfast room. The doors were open, and Cecily caught her first glimpse of him. Lawrence Ashcombe stood by the tall windows, his silhouette outlined against the pale light. The coat he wore was dark, cut perfectly to his frame, but there was tension in the set of his shoulders. The cane leaned against the table beside him, a silent testament to his pain. He turned at the sound of movement, his grey eyes sharp, assessing. For a heartbeat, Cecily thought he might dismiss her before she even spoke. "So," he said quietly, "the housekeeper has brought me another ghost to haunt these halls." Cecily felt her pulse quicken, but kept her tone even. "I'm not a ghost, my lord. I'm here to work." His brows lifted slightly. The answer was not insolent, merely unafraid. "And what is your name, then, if not ghost?" "Cecily Fairley." He studied her for a moment longer, then turned away, the edge of his voice softening almost imperceptibly. "Well, Miss Fairley, if you wish to stay, see that you do your work quietly. I have no need of chatter and no taste for sympathy." "I understand," she said. He looked back over his shoulder, surprised perhaps by her composure, perhaps by the steadiness in her eyes. "Do you?" "Most don't." Cecily's gaze did not waver. Then perhaps most don't try, my lord. For a brief instant, something flickered in his expression. Curiosity, irritation, maybe both. Then, as if ashamed of the weakness of feeling, he turned back toward the window. "Mrs. Bracken, you may go," he said curtly. The housekeeper withdrew, leaving them in the hushed space between ticking clock and rain against glass. Cecily moved to pour tea from the silver pot, careful but not trembling. The silence pressed close. When she set the cup before him, her sleeve brushed his hand. It was accidental, but the touch felt electric. Lawrence froze, and Cecily drew back at once. "My apologies, my lord." He looked at her hand, then at her face, the bitterness returning like armor. "Be careful, Miss Fairley. Pity is a dangerous thing. It can ruin a man faster than his own injury." "I wasn't pitying you," she replied softly, "only serving you." Their eyes met for the first time, his filled with guarded pride, hers with unspoken kindness. The air between them shifted, not with affection yet, but with a fragile awareness neither could name. After a moment he gestured toward the tray. "That will be all." Cecily curtsied and stepped back, but as she turned to leave, she noticed the letter half burned in the grate. The red wax seal had melted into a pool, and a single line of delicate handwriting remained unscorched. "I wish you well, but cannot continue under such circumstances." She looked away quickly, feeling something tighten in her chest. The house seemed to hold its breath again. Outside, the rain softened to a mist, and a faint wind stirred through the wet hedgerows. Cecily crossed the corridor, her heart unsteady, though she could not say why. Behind her, in the silent room, Lawrence stood alone, staring at the empty doorway she had just passed through, his reflection dim in the window glass, and for the first time since his return, the silence felt heavier for her absence. The morning after her arrival, the manor greeted Cecily with the kind of silence that had no beginning and no end. The mist from the hills hung low over the lawns, pressing against the windows until the glass filmed with breath. The faint scent of beeswax and damp stone filled the air as she carried a basin up the servants' staircase, her steps careful, the sound of her shoes muffled by the old carpet-runner. Ashcombe Manor was beautiful, but in a tragic way. The halls were lined with portraits of ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow her, gentlemen with powdered wigs and stern matrons in lace caps, all watching as though she were a trespasser in their kingdom. Somewhere, far above the grand staircase, a door closed. The sound echoed like the memory of footsteps that had once filled the house. In the servants' corridor, Mrs. Bracken was already instructing the staff in her brisk voice. "The Marquis will breakfast alone, as usual. See that his fire burns steadily, and that no one lingers outside the East Hall. Miss Fairley, you'll assist with the morning service. He prefers silence." "Yes, ma'am," Cecily answered. The housekeeper paused, softening her tone. "Don't let his manner discourage you. His temper isn't cruelty, it's pain. He once laughed easily, you know, before—" She stopped herself, her eyes flicking toward the upper floor. "Well, before." Cecily nodded and adjusted her cap. "Pain should not be reason to lose kindness, ma'am, but I'll do my duty." When she entered the breakfast room, she found Lawrence seated near the tall window again, his profile outlined by pale light. His cane rested against the chair, his gloved hand curled loosely on the armrest. The tray was already laid before him, tea steaming faintly, bread still warm. He did not look up as she entered. She curtsied quietly. "Good morning, my lord." He made no reply. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the mantel and the faint rustle of her apron as she adjusted the table. Cecily poured his tea, measured a spoon of sugar, and stepped back, waiting. Still, he did not speak. His eyes remained fixed on the window, where the mist was thinning into a fragile kind of light. Finally, without turning, he said, "Do you find silence uncomfortable, Miss Fairley?" "No, my lord. Most people do. They rush to fill it with chatter, as if words could frighten away their thoughts. I have learned that silence says more than words, sometimes." He turned his head slightly, studying her. "And what do you imagine silence is saying to you now?" Cecily met his gaze. That my employer prefers solitude, but perhaps not as much as he pretends. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth, gone before it could soften his expression. You speak plainly for a servant. I was told honesty pleases a master more than flattery. Whoever told you that has never met society, he said dryly, then lifted his teacup. Cecily inclined her head, resisting the urge to smile. There was something in his tone, not cruelty, but a weary sort of wit, as though he still carried the memory of a sharper man buried beneath the bitterness. When she withdrew to the adjoining antechamber, her pulse was unsteady. She had not meant to challenge him, yet she sensed he needed it. A man trapped behind pride needed something stronger than pity to reach him. Outside, the morning unfolded into the soft rhythm of work. The scent of baking bread drifted up from the kitchens, mingling with the smoke from the chimneys. In the gardens, the gardener's boy raked wet leaves into neat piles, his song faint under the coo of doves. The world seemed peaceful, yet every corridor inside the house still echoed with what was missing. That afternoon, Cecily carried a tray of correspondence to the library. She paused at the threshold. Lawrence was there, standing by the shelves, his weight uneven as he reached for a volume on the upper row. The cane leaned against the table beside him. Without it, his movements were tense, controlled. "My lord," she said quietly, "the Morning Post." He looked down at her from his unsteady height. "Leave it there." "Yes, my lord." As she set the letters on the desk, one fell to the floor. She bent quickly to retrieve it, but Lawrence reached at the same time, and their hands brushed. It was a fleeting contact, skin against skin, but the moment seemed to stretch, filled with something neither could name. Cecily looked up. Her breath caught. Lawrence's face was close enough that she could see the faint line of exhaustion around his eyes, the scar near his temple where the skin had healed unevenly. He withdrew his hand at once, his jaw tightening. "Be careful," he said, though his voice was quieter than before. "You'll find the world less forgiving of small mistakes than I am." "I'm not afraid of mistakes," she replied softly, "only of not learning from them." He turned away as if her calm unsettled him more than defiance would have. "That is a luxury of those who are still allowed to err," he said. Cecily's heart tightened at the bitterness in his words. "And are you not, my lord?" He looked at her sharply. "No. When a man is broken, the world stops seeing him as human. It makes him symbol or spectacle, both are cages." "I don't see a cage," Cecily said after a moment. "Only a man standing beside a window, choosing whether to open it." The silence that followed was heavy, but not hostile. Lawrence studied her for a long breath, then spoke, almost to himself. "You speak as though you've known confinement." "In my way, perhaps I have," she answered. "Not all prisons have walls, my lord. Some are made of expectations." He said nothing more, but the corner of his mouth twitched, almost a smile, almost gratitude. When she left the library, his eyes followed her to the door, though she did not see it. Later that evening, the household gathered in the servants' hall. Laughter echoed faintly as the cook told a story, but Cecily sat apart, sewing a tear in one of the linens. Mrs. Bracken joined her, folding napkins with precise hands. "He spoke to you today," the housekeeper said quietly. "Yes, ma'am, briefly." "Then you've accomplished more than most. Since his return he has spoken only to me, the steward, and the vicar, and when he does, it's never kindly." "He wasn't unkind," Cecily said. "Just guarded." Mrs. Bracken sighed. "Guarded is a word for those who still wish to be understood. The Marquis does not. He carries his grief like a sword, sharp, but safer in his hand than in anyone else's." Cecily's needle paused above the fabric. "Perhaps he only needs a reason to lower it." The older woman looked at her with quiet warning. "Be careful, child. Men of his world aren't meant to see us as anything but servants. It's not cruelty, it's how they're taught. Do your work well and keep your heart steady." "I will," Cecily said. But that night, as she lay in the narrow servants' room, she found herself thinking of the Marquis's eyes, grey as storm clouds, yet strangely alive when anger lit them. She wondered what he had been like before pain made him retreat into silence. The next morning dawned bright and clear, rare for spring. The rain had washed the hills clean, leaving the air sharp and sweet. Cecily rose early to tend the hearth in the drawing room. The fire was stubborn, refusing to catch. She leaned closer, blowing softly on the embers. Behind her, a voice said, "You'll blacken your face if you lean that close." She started and turned. Lawrence stood in the doorway, cane in hand, his expression unreadable. "My lord, I didn't hear you." "I move quietly when I choose," he said, "though I suppose my limp announces me soon enough." Cecily straightened, brushing soot from her apron. "It's only a sound, not a fault." His brows rose. "You are not like the others, Miss Fairley. Most avoid saying such things aloud. Perhaps they fear it will sound improper. And you—" "I fear nothing that is true," she said simply. Lawrence's gaze lingered on her face, searching. The morning light caught in her eyes, making them glow warm amber against the pale blue of the walls. For a heartbeat, the distance between them vanished. Then he looked away, as though the nearness had startled him. "I cannot decide," he murmured, "if you are brave or foolish." "Maybe both," Cecily said. "Sometimes it takes foolishness to do what's right." A shadow of amusement crossed his face, an expression that made him for the first time look younger. "You're an unusual maid, Miss Fairley. Only an honest one." He nodded, then turned toward the window. Outside, the sunlight stretched across the gardens, glinting off the damp stone paths. For a long moment, neither spoke. The air between them was filled with something delicate and invisible, a quiet awareness that felt like the beginning of understanding. Lawrence broke the silence at last. "The village fair begins this week. I used to attend before the accident. I hear it still draws half the county." Cecily folded her hands, unsure what to say. "It must have been a fine thing." "It was," he said softly. "Now it feels like a story told about another man." Then perhaps," Cecily said carefully, "it's time that man remembered he still exists." Lawrence turned his head, meeting her eyes. The challenge in her voice was gentle, but it stirred something long dormant within him. "You think it's that simple?" he asked. "I think nothing worth living for is ever simple." He studied her again, his expression unreadable. Then he gave a faint nod. "Perhaps one day, Miss Fairley, you'll learn that truth is rarely welcome in fine houses. And yet someone must keep it alive," she answered. He looked at her as if he had forgotten how it felt to be truly seen. Then, without another word, he turned and left the room, the sound of his cane fading down the corridor. Cecily watched him go, her heart pounding, though she could not have said why. She touched her hand to her apron, still feeling the echo of the warmth from the moment their fingers had brushed the day before. Outside, the sun climbed higher, spilling golden light across the manor's stone facade. The house seemed less like a tomb and more like a place awakening from a long sleep. And somewhere in its quiet heart, between the sound of footsteps and the whisper of the wind, something fragile began to change, a tenderness not yet spoken, but already alive. The following morning broke with a fragile kind of sunlight, pale and hesitant, as though even the heavens feared to disturb the silence of Ashcombe Manor. The rain of the previous night had left pearls of water glistening on the ivy that climbed the golden stone walls. Birds sang softly beyond the hedgerows, and the faint scent of wet earth drifted through the open windows. Yet inside, the manor remained as still as a chapel between prayers. Cecily moved quietly through the hall, balancing a tray of freshly cut flowers. She arranged them in tall vases along the corridor, her fingers brushing the petals with care. Since her arrival, she had begun these small, almost invisible changes. A window opened to the morning air, a neglected corner dusted, a forgotten vase filled again. No one remarked upon it, but she could feel the house beginning to breathe. In the library, Lawrence sat by the fire with a book he wasn't reading. The flames cast shifting light across his face, illuminating the sharp line of his jaw and the grey in his eyes. He heard the faint sound of movement outside, the light rhythm of footsteps he had come to recognize as hers. And for a moment, something inside him stirred that he did not wish to name. She entered carrying the flowers, her gaze lowered, but her presence filled the room, like warmth returning to winter. When she reached the table beside him, she hesitated, uncertain whether to disturb him. "Good morning, my lord," she said softly. He looked up. "You seem determined to fill this house with color." "I thought it might help," she replied, setting the vase near the window. "The air feels less heavy when there are living things near it." A faint smile, rare and fleeting, touched his mouth. "I fear, Miss Fairley, that flowers cannot mend what is broken here." "Perhaps not," she said, turning toward him, "but they remind us that something still grows, even after winter." Her words lingered in the air. He watched her as she straightened a loose petal, her sleeve brushing the light. There was nothing bold in her manner, and yet she carried a quiet defiance, as though she refused to let despair reign unchallenged. "You speak like someone who has known loss," he murmured. Cecily met his gaze briefly, then looked away. "I've known hard seasons, my lord, but they pass, as all things do." He studied her face, seeing something he could not quite define. Strength, gentleness, perhaps both. He wanted to ask her more, but the words stayed behind the wall of his own reserve. "Do you ever go beyond the gates?" she asked suddenly. He blinked, surprised. "No, there is no need." "Sometimes a walk in fresh air helps," she said cautiously. "The hills are green after the rain. Even a short one might do you good." Lawrence's expression darkened, pride and pain flickering through his eyes. "You forget, Miss Fairley, I am no longer suited for such indulgence." "It's not indulgence to live," she answered softly. Her tone was not rebellious, only honest. It pierced him more deeply than pity ever could. He turned his gaze toward the fire, gripping the arm of his chair. "I will not parade my weakness before the village." "No one would call you weak for breathing the same air as the rest of us," she said, her voice low but unwavering. The silence that followed trembled with tension. Cecily felt her heart beating fast, aware she had crossed an invisible line. But instead of anger, Lawrence's face softened into something like surrender. "You are a stubborn woman," he said at last. "Only when I believe something is right." He sighed, his eyes falling to the cane at his side. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then he said quietly, "Very well, one walk, but only within the estate grounds, and only once." Cecily's lips curved in the faintest smile. "That will do." Later that afternoon, the sun broke fully through the clouds, turning the fields into sheets of gold. The air smelled of grass and rain. Cecily waited near the side path that wound toward the orchard, her hands folded neatly before her apron. Lawrence appeared at last, leaning heavily on his cane, his stride deliberate. "This seems foolish already," he muttered. "It will seem less so once you've walked a little," Cecily said gently. He frowned at her composure, but there was no real heat in it. Slowly they began to move down the path. The ground was soft from the rain, and the scent of damp soil rose around them. Lawrence's limp was pronounced, but his posture remained proud. Every step seemed to cost him effort, yet he refused to let it show. They passed under the old ash trees, where sunlight fell in shifting patterns. A thrush sang somewhere nearby. Cecily kept close enough to steady him if he stumbled, but far enough that he would not feel watched. After several minutes his breath grew uneven. The path sloped gently upward, and he paused, leaning on his cane. "Satisfied?" he said through clenched teeth. "You see, this is what happens when pride meets foolish optimism." Cecily took a step closer. "It's not foolish to try." "Easy for you to say," he snapped. "You're not the one who falls." Her voice softened. "Then let me be the one who helps you stand." He looked at her sharply, his grey eyes blazing with something fierce, anger perhaps, or shame, but when he saw the sincerity in her face, the fight drained from him. "Don't look at me that way," he said quietly. "You make it too easy to forget what I am." "And what are you, my lord?" "A man diminished." Cecily shook her head. No, only a man learning how to walk again. He turned away, struggling with words that would not form. The breeze lifted a strand of her hair, brushing it across her cheek. Without thinking, he reached out and tucked it behind her ear. The motion was gentle, but when his fingers touched her skin, he froze, as though realizing what he had done. Cecily's breath caught. For a moment, neither moved. Their eyes locked, and something unspoken passed between them, something fragile, forbidden, and entirely alive. He lowered his hand, his voice unsteady. "Forgive me." "There's nothing to forgive," she whispered. They continued walking, the silence between them no longer empty, but full of quiet emotion. Lawrence's steps grew steadier, though pain shadowed his face. Cecily said nothing, knowing that pride sometimes needed silence more than sympathy. When they reached the orchard, Lawrence stopped beneath the branches, heavy with new blossoms. He looked around, as if seeing the place for the first time. "I used to ride through here every morning," he said softly. "The air smelled of apple and wild thyme. I thought it would never end." Cecily smiled faintly. "Perhaps it hasn't ended, my lord. It's only waiting." He met her gaze, something raw, flickering in his expression. "You speak as if you believe time can be kind." "I believe it can be merciful," she said, "if we let it." He looked away, eyes tracing the horizon where the manor roof rose above the trees. "You make me remember things I would rather forget." "Then perhaps you've remembered too little," she said gently. He turned to her again, and this time he did not look away. "You think you can mend what the world has broken? I think no one is beyond mending." Their eyes met, and for a long moment the world seemed to still, the hum of bees in the orchard, the whisper of leaves, all fading into the space between them. Lawrence felt the old walls around his heart tremble, as though one honest word might make them fall entirely. He drew a breath and straightened, resting more lightly on his cane. "You are impertinent, Miss Fairley." Cecily inclined her head. "I've been called worse." "By me? Not yet." The corner of his mouth curved, the smallest trace of a smile. "Then I must be losing my edge." "Or finding it again," she said softly. They began the slow walk back to the manor. The sun dipped lower, washing the fields in amber light. As they approached the gates, Cecily noticed that Lawrence no longer leaned quite so heavily on his cane. His steps were uneven, but sure, the rhythm of a man reclaiming something he thought lost. When they reached the terrace, he stopped to catch his breath. "That will suffice for your experiment," he said, his tone lighter than before. "You may consider your victory complete." "It wasn't a victory, my lord," she replied. "Only proof." "Proof of what?" "That even broken wings remember how to fly." He looked at her then, truly looked, and for the first time in months the air around him felt less like a cage. "You are dangerous, Miss Fairley," he said quietly. "You make me forget the comfort of my misery." "Then perhaps your misery was never meant to be comfortable." He drew in a slow breath, his voice barely above a whisper. "You speak like someone who believes in miracles." "I believe in courage," she said, her eyes steady on his. "And I think you have more of it than you know." For a long moment they stood facing each other as the last light of day fell over them. The wind stirred again, carrying the scent of apple blossom between them. Lawrence's heart thudded with a strange mixture of gratitude and fear. Gratitude for her presence, fear of what it was awakening. When Cecily turned to go, he spoke her name softly. "Miss Fairley?" She stopped, her hand resting lightly on the banister. "Yes, my lord." "Thank you." It was a simple word, but it carried the weight of everything he could not yet say. Cecily curtsied, her voice quiet but certain. "You're welcome, my lord." She disappeared down the corridor, her steps fading into the hush of the house. Lawrence remained where he stood, watching the fading light through the windows, feeling the strange, disarming warmth of her presence linger even in her absence. Outside, the dusk settled over the hills, and for the first time since his return, the gates of Ashcombe Manor no longer felt like prison bars. They felt like doors waiting to be opened again. The wind rose that evening with the insistence of an old ghost. It rattled the shutters, swept through the chimneys, and carried with it the smell of rain-soaked earth from the valley below. Inside Ashcombe Manor, the servants hurried to secure the windows before the storm arrived. The candles flickered in their holders, the air thick with the scent of wax and damp stone. Cecily moved swiftly along the corridor, balancing a tray of lamps in both hands. The faint flame in each glass trembled as she passed. She had learned the moods of the house by now, the way the light shifted with the weather, how every door groaned differently, how silence could be heavy or kind, depending on who breathed it. But that night the silence was different. It felt expectant, like the hush before a confession. In the library the fire burned low. Lawrence sat in a high-backed chair, the cane resting beside him, his eyes fixed on the flames, as if they alone held the answers to a question he could not voice. The book open on his lap had not been read. He had been listening for something he didn't realize he was waiting for. Her step in the hall. When Cecily entered carrying the lamps, the faint scent of lavender followed her. "The storm's nearly upon us, my lord," she said softly. "I've come to secure the windows." He glanced up. "Does the housekeeper send you to chase the wind now?" Her smile was faint but not afraid. "She says I have a steady hand, the others dread thunder." "Then you are braver than most." "I only do what must be done," she replied, moving toward the window. The curtains stirred as she fastened the latch. Outside, lightning illuminated the garden, the apple trees bending, the stone statues gleaming pale for an instant before the dark returned. Lawrence watched her silently. The lamplight cast her shadow against the shelves, her movements graceful and deliberate. She seemed untouched by fear, though the manor shuddered with the storm's strength. He admired that quiet composure, that refusal to cower before chaos. "Do storms not unsettle you, Miss Fairley?" he asked after a pause. She looked over her shoulder. "No, my lord. They remind me that even the heavens must break now and then." The words struck him more deeply than she could have known. He studied her in the dim glow, the curve of her cheek illuminated by candlelight, the serenity that softened her features. Something within him stirred, not the sharp pang of pain he had grown used to, but a gentler ache, almost human. Cecily moved toward the hearth to tend the fire. The hem of her dark dress brushed the floor as she knelt, her fingers steady on the poker. Lawrence's gaze lingered on the rhythm of her hands, the care with which she coaxed life from the embers. The silence between them thickened, charged with unspoken words. When the fire caught again, she rose and brushed a stray curl from her temple. "There now," she said, her voice low. "It won't go out again tonight." "You seem certain." "Because I watched it," she replied. "Fires die when no one tends them." He looked at her for a long time, his expression unreadable. "You speak of flames as though they were people." "Perhaps people are not so different," she said. "They burn, they fade, and they need care to stay alive." He turned his gaze back to the hearth. "You make everything sound simple." "It isn't," Cecily said gently, "but sometimes it helps to pretend it could be." The storm broke then, sudden and fierce. Thunder shook the walls, rain lashed the glass in heavy sheets. The lights flickered. Without thinking, Cecily stepped nearer to the table to steady the nearest lamp. Her hand brushed the edge of the book on his lap, and for an instant his fingers covered hers. The contact was brief, almost nothing. Yet in that briefness lay 1,000 unsaid things. She froze, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. His hand was warm, the pressure light but certain, as though he were reminding himself she was real. He let go a moment later, his voice low. "Forgive me." "There's nothing to forgive," she murmured, her cheeks flushed. He looked away, guilt and longing twisting in his chest. "You should go. The hall will flood if the windows are not checked." "I've already secured them all," she said quietly. This was the last room. Lightning flared again, throwing both of their faces into brightness. Cecily saw in his eyes a loneliness so deep it frightened her. An emptiness built not from cruelty, but from too much silence, too much endurance. "You're not afraid of me," he said at last, almost wonderingly. "I see no reason to be." "You should be," he whispered. "People fear what they do not understand." "Then perhaps I understand you better than most." Her words fell between them like an invitation and a warning. Lawrence rose slowly from his chair, his weight uneven, but his movements deliberate. He took a step toward her, then another, until only the small table with the lamp separated them. "Tell me, Miss Fairley," he said, his voice a blend of curiosity and disbelief. "What is it you think you understand?" Cecily's throat tightened. The storm outside howled, and yet she could hear only the rhythm of his voice. "That you are not cruel," she said, "only wounded, and that the world mistook your silence for arrogance when it was simply pain." He stared at her, his jaw tense, his breath uneven. For a long time he said nothing. Then quietly he asked, "Do you pity me?" "No, my lord." The firmness of her tone startled him. "Then what is it you feel?" Cecily hesitated, the truth trembling on her lips. "Respect and sorrow, because I think you've forgotten what it is to be looked at with kindness." He inhaled sharply, as if her words struck a place still raw. "Kindness can be as cruel as scorn," he said. "It gives hope where none should exist." "Hope isn't cruelty," she said softly. "It's survival." For a long moment, he could not look away. The candlelight flickered across her face. The fire glowed behind her like a halo of gold, and for the first time since the accident, Lawrence felt warmth that had nothing to do with fire. Another flash of lightning lit the room. The lamps trembled. One flame went out. Without thinking, Cecily reached to relight it, but her match slipped from trembling fingers. Lawrence caught it before it fell, his hand brushing hers again. This time neither moved away. "Miss Fairley," he said in a low, unsteady tone, "you should leave. It's late. And yet, my lord, you haven't dismissed me." The air between them thickened. He could hear the rain hammering against the glass, the wind in the chimneys, the distant creak of the old timbers. But all of it seemed far away. Only her voice remained near, steady and quiet, and it unnerved him. "You tempt me toward a life I no longer have the right to want," he said, his voice trembling with restraint. Cecily's eyes softened. "Then perhaps life still has the right to want you." He looked at her with something close to anguish. "You speak like a poet, only like a woman who has seen enough sorrow to recognize its end when it stands before her." The words hung in the air, fragile as spun glass. Then, as if frightened by his own thoughts, Lawrence turned away sharply. He gripped the back of the chair to steady himself. "You should go," he said again, though the command lacked conviction. Cecily lingered for a moment, watching the flicker of firelight across his face, the struggle between pride and longing written in every line. She wanted to speak, to tell him he need not face the darkness alone, but the storm's roar drowned her courage. Instead, she took one of the lamps and placed it near him. "So, you won't be in the dark," she said quietly. He did not answer. She curtsied and moved toward the door. When she reached it, his voice stopped her. "Miss Fairley," she turned. "Do you ever regret the things you say to me?" Her heart beat wildly. "No, my lord." "Do you?" He hesitated. "Every word I don't say." For a breathless instant, neither moved. The wind moaned through the chimneys. The candles flickered as though listening. Then Cecily nodded once, her eyes shining, and slipped from the room. Lawrence remained by the fire long after she had gone. The lamp she had left glowed softly beside him, the wick steady and bright. He stared into the flame, hearing her voice in his mind, her calm defiance, her gentleness that refused to bow. Outside the storm raged, but within the manor something quieter had begun. A storm of another kind, the sort that burned in silence and left no ruin behind, only the faint, impossible promise of warmth. He touched the match she had dropped, still faintly warm from her fingers, and closed his hand around it. "You will undo me, Miss Fairley," he whispered into the firelight. And somewhere beyond the hall, Cecily stood by the window in her small room, watching the lightning illuminate the orchard. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass, her face pale, her heart too full. She could still feel the ghost of his touch, the tremor in his voice, the confession neither of them dared to speak. The rain drummed on the roof, washing the world clean, and though both were alone in their separate rooms, each knew the truth the other could not yet say. Something had begun in the quiet heart of the storm, and it would not be silenced again. The morning after the storm broke bright and clear, as if the sky itself wished to erase the memory of its violence. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Ashcombe Manor, touching the worn stone floors with gold. The air was sweet, with the scent of wet earth and blooming hawthorn, and for the first time in many weeks the house did not feel asleep. Cecily rose before dawn, her mind restless. The events of the previous night, his voice, his nearness, the tremor that had crossed his words like a confession half-spoken, lingered in her thoughts. She told herself it meant nothing, that kindness was her duty, not indulgence. Yet every time she closed her eyes, she saw him standing by the firelight, the flame reflected in his grey eyes. When she entered the breakfast room, Mrs. Bracken was already there, overseeing preparations. The housekeeper's expression softened at the sight of her. "The Marquis has requested that the carriage be readied," she said in a tone of disbelief. "The carriage?" Cecily asked, her hands tightening around the tray she carried. Mrs. Bracken nodded. "A short visit to the village, so I'm told. The first in nearly a year. He'll attend the early service at St. Martin's. The vicar received word last evening." Cecily felt her heart lift and ache at once. She thought of his words during the storm. "You tempt me toward a life I no longer have the right to want." Perhaps he had decided to face the world again. By mid-morning the carriage stood at the steps, its black lacquer gleaming beneath the sunlight. Lawrence appeared in the doorway, tall and composed, though the cane in his hand betrayed the cost of every step. His attire was formal, a dark blue coat with brass buttons, a crisp cravat, his hair tied neatly back. The faint colour returned to his cheeks after so long in shadow. The servants paused in their work to watch him descend the steps. There was awe in their silence. The master of Ashcombe Manor had returned to the world of the living. Cecily stood near the door, her apron folded, her heart thundering in her chest. When Lawrence reached the last step, he turned to her. "Miss Fairley," he said quietly, "I trust the morning finds you well." "Yes, my lord," she managed, her voice soft. He studied her for a moment, as if searching for something familiar in her face, something that steadied him. Then, inclining his head, he said, "You were right about fresh air. Let us see if the village shares your optimism." The horses started down the long lane that led through the estate. From her place at the window, Cecily watched until the carriage vanished behind the hedgerows. The sunlight fell on her hands, and she realized she was smiling. The village of Ashcombe was small and orderly, a cluster of cottages wrapped in climbing roses and ivy. Children paused their games to stare as the carriage approached. When Lawrence stepped out before the old church, murmurs rippled through the crowd gathered by the gate. "The Marquis," someone whispered. "He's returned." He stood straight, his expression calm, though inside he felt every pair of eyes upon him like the weight of judgment. The vicar, Reverend Crowthorne, came forward at once, his kind face bright with welcome. "My lord, this is a blessing. We feared we might not see you here again." Lawrence offered a faint smile. "It seems even a recluse may seek grace, Reverend." The vicar gestured toward the open door. "Then come and take it, my lord. The house of God does not close its doors to the wounded." Inside the small church, sunlight spilled through stained glass, painting the pews in colors of crimson and blue. The scent of candles and lavender filled the air. Lawrence walked with slow dignity to his seat near the front, aware of every rustle, every whisper that followed him. Cecily had come on foot, unnoticed, to stand quietly among the servants at the back. She had told herself she only wished to be sure he managed the journey safely. Yet as she saw him there, outlined by colored light, She felt a quiet reverence rise within her, not for his title, but for his courage. When the choir began to sing, Lawrence bowed his head. His fingers tightened around his cane, his breath steady but deep. The words of the hymn, about mercy, endurance, and the forgiveness of one's own heart, cut through him. He had come to endure the gaze of others, but it was his own reflection in their eyes that humbled him. When the service ended, the congregation gathered outside beneath the churchyard oaks. The air was warm, the scent of grass mingling with that of the villagers' Sunday finery. Fresh linen, polished leather, wildflowers pinned to hats. Mrs. Alder, the baker's wife, approached first, curtsying. "It does our hearts good to see you, my lord. The village has missed your presence." Lawrence inclined his head, polite but distant. "You are kind, Mrs. Alder. I trust your son still apprentices with the blacksmith?" "Yes, my lord, and speaks of it with pride." Another villager stepped forward, a farmer, then an old woman with kind eyes, and each offered the same mixture of sympathy and curiosity. The air was thick with admiration, disguised as pity. Cecily watched from a short distance, her hands clasped tightly before her. She could see the effort it cost him to stand among them, to meet their gazes without retreating into pride or pain. His shoulders remained square, but there was a flicker of weariness in his face. When the vicar approached again, smiling, he said warmly, "It is good to have you among us, Lord Ashcombe. I pray this will not be your last visit." Lawrence's lips curved faintly. "That depends, Reverend, on whether heaven grants patience for stubborn men." The vicar chuckled. "Patience is precisely what heaven is made for." A ripple of laughter moved through the small crowd, easing the tension. For the first time, Lawrence's posture softened. He turned slightly and caught Cecily's gaze across the churchyard. Her eyes shone with quiet pride. She lowered her head, but he could see the faint smile she tried to hide. Something inside him, something long silent, felt like gratitude. On their return to the manor, the afternoon light lay warm across the fields. The horses' hooves clattered softly on the stones. Inside the carriage, Lawrence sat back, the air thick with the scent of leather and polish. The cane rested beside him, but his hand no longer gripped it as tightly. When they reached the estate gates, he found Cecily waiting in the courtyard, her apron fluttering in the light breeze. The sight of her there felt like the closing of a circle, his leaving and returning, both marked by her presence. "How was the village, my lord?" she asked as he stepped down. "Smaller than I remembered," he said quietly, "and kinder. I'm glad." He looked at her, and for a moment the world around them vanished. The noise of the servants, the horses, the rustling of leaves. Only her face remained, calm and open, her eyes full of something he dared not name. "Miss Fairley," he said, his voice lower now, "I find it peculiar. The things you say linger in the mind long after you've gone." She blushed faintly. "I don't mean to trouble your thoughts, my lord." "You don't trouble them," he said softly. "You steady them." Cecily's breath caught. "Then perhaps we trouble each other equally." His gaze deepened, but he did not answer. He turned instead toward the house, though the ghost of a smile touched his mouth. That evening, after supper, Cecily brought tea to the drawing-room. The firelight painted the walls in gold and shadow. Lawrence stood by the window, looking out toward the darkening gardens. His reflection trembled in the glass, as if uncertain whether it belonged to him. "You've had a long day," she said gently. He turned, his expression thoughtful. "Do you know, Miss Fairley, I was certain I would despise every moment of it. I expected whispers, pity, all the cruelties that well-meaning people can give. And yet—" he paused, searching for words. "It was not as I imagined." "Because you faced it," she said. "Fear grows in darkness, not in daylight." He regarded her, his voice softer. "Do you truly believe the world forgives so easily?" "I don't know if it forgives," she said, "but it forgets less quickly when we hide from it." He laughed quietly, a sound almost foreign on his lips. "You have a strange gift for making me see sense." "It isn't a gift, my lord, just a different way of looking." The candlelight caught her eyes, and he found himself drawn toward her before he realized it. "And how do you look at me, Miss Fairley?" he asked. Her voice trembled slightly, though her words were steady. "As a man who has forgotten he is allowed to live." He went still, her honesty disarming him. Their gazes held, the air between them thick with something fragile and alive. He wanted to reach for her hand, to thank her, to ask her to stay, but the weight of propriety pressed like a wall between them. Instead, he said quietly, "The world sees me as damaged. You look at me as if that word does not exist." "It doesn't," she replied. "Not where kindness lives." The silence that followed was almost sacred. The storm had left the manor's air cleaner, the scent of rain still clinging to the night. The fire crackled softly, the light shifting across their faces. At last he spoke, his voice low but certain. "Miss Fairley, I am beginning to think you are far more dangerous than you appear." She smiled faintly. "Then perhaps danger can be gentle, my lord." He turned toward the fire, his eyes shadowed, but his heart beating with an unfamiliar rhythm. "Gentle," he repeated almost to himself. "Yes, but not harmless." When Cecily left the room, her footsteps quiet against the floor, Lawrence remained by the window. The moon had risen above the orchards, its light silver against the damp fields. The reflection in the glass showed a man still limping, still marked, but no longer wholly alone. Outside, the wind stirred the branches, carrying the faint fragrance of apple blossoms. It was the same wind that had touched her hair that afternoon when she smiled at him across the churchyard. And in that moment, Lawrence knew that something had changed irrevocably. Not the world, not his fate, but his heart. It had begun, quietly and without his consent, to hope again. Summer descended upon the Cotswolds with deceptive gentleness. The hills glowed green beneath skies as pale as porcelain, the orchards breathed perfume, and the air shimmered faintly with bees and light. But within the walls of Ashcombe Manor, a different kind of restlessness took hold, a quiet anticipation, as though something long buried were about to stir. Cecily felt it first. The household carried whispers again, small and uncertain. A visitor was expected. Mrs. Bracken spoke little, her eyes more watchful than usual. The steward, always discreet, polished the silver himself. Even the cook's laughter, usually a constant melody in the kitchen, was replaced by murmured conversations that ended the moment Cecily entered. By midday, she learned the truth. Lady Imogen Harrowby had arrived in the Cotswolds. The name struck like a bell in Cecily's mind, its tone clear and cold. The former fiancée, the woman whose absence had carved silence into the heart of the Marquis. She said nothing, only folded the linens with measured precision, her hands steady while her pulse quickened beneath the calm. When she carried the tray to the drawing-room that evening, the air already felt different. Lawrence sat by the window, the last of the daylight outlining his profile in gold. His coat was unbuttoned, his cravat loosened, the fatigue of thought resting heavy on his face. He turned as she entered, and she saw it at once. The distant look, the shadow of memory returning to his eyes. "Lady Harrowby is in the village," he said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. Cecily's breath faltered, but she recovered quickly. "So I've heard, my lord. She called at the vicarage this afternoon," he continued, staring past her. "I imagine she intends to call here next." Cecily set the tray down carefully. "Perhaps she means only to pay her respects." He gave a bitter laugh. "Imogen Harrowby has never done anything without calculation. Her respect, like her affection, comes at a price." Cecily hesitated. "Then perhaps it is not worth paying again." Her words hung between them, soft yet daring. Lawrence looked at her, really looked, and for the briefest moment the hardness in his expression faltered. "You speak boldly for one who has never stood before her." "I've stood before pain," Cecily said gently. "I imagine the difference is small." He said nothing, but the muscle in his jaw tightened, betraying the storm behind his composure. When Cecily left the room, her heart ached with something she could neither define nor justify. She told herself it was concern for him, that was all. But when she passed the great hall and saw the portraits of his ancestors in the dim light, she understood what she feared. Not the return of a woman, but the power she held over the man Cecily had come to care for. 2 days later, the sound of wheels on gravel announced what everyone had expected. The Harrowby carriage gleamed in the sunlight, its crest flashing gold against the polished door. From her place in the corridor, Cecily watched as Lady Imogen descended, a vision of refinement, every detail designed to impress. Her gown was of pale lilac silk, trimmed with lace so fine it shimmered like frost. A bonnet of ivory ribbon framed her face, its softness enhancing the deliberate coolness of her smile. Her beauty was undeniable, sculpted and precise, untouched by humility. When she stepped forward, even the air seemed to yield. Lawrence appeared in the doorway of the drawing room. For a long moment, neither spoke. Time itself seemed to pause, as though the manor waited to see which of them would breathe first. "Imogen," he said at last, his voice calm but distant. "My lord," she replied, her curtsy perfect. "It has been far too long. Not long enough, perhaps." Her smile did not falter. "You've not changed. Still proud, still determined to keep the world at arm's length. I learned that lesson from experience." She tilted her head, feigning innocence. "Then I hope you learned it well, for I intend no harm. I only wish to see how you fare. The countryside speaks of your seclusion." He gestured toward the parlor. "Then the countryside is well informed." She followed him inside, her perfume, something sweet and elusive, lingering in the air long after she passed. Cecily, who had been standing discreetly near the entrance, turned to leave, but Imogen's voice stopped her. "And who is this?" Lady Harrowby asked, with polite curiosity sharpened by condescension. Lawrence turned. "Miss Cecily Fairley. She assists Mrs. Bracken in the household." Imogen's smile softened, though her eyes gleamed. "Ah, a new face then. I see you've kept good company during your exile." Cecily bowed slightly. "Good afternoon, my lady." "Good afternoon," Imogen replied, her tone sweet enough to burn. Cecily excused herself at once, though she felt the weight of Imogen's gaze follow her until she vanished from sight. Inside the parlor, silence stretched thin. Lawrence leaned against the mantel, watching his former fiancée as she removed her gloves with slow precision. "Say what you came to say, Imogen. I tire of polite performance." She looked up, feigning surprise. "And yet I came only to apologize, Lawrence, for my haste, for leaving you when I should have stayed." His laugh was short, bitter. "You left because my limp offended your vanity. No apology can change that." She rose, crossing the room with practiced grace. "You think me heartless, but can you imagine what it was to see the man I loved return from war? Pale, wounded, stripped of all the brilliance that once surrounded him. I was frightened. Of my pain, of your weakness," she whispered, "and my own." He stared at her, his expression unreadable. "Then you were right to leave. Weakness should not be shared. It only multiplies." "Perhaps," she said softly. "We were both foolish." "Perhaps," he echoed, but his tone carried no forgiveness. Outside, Cecily stood in the hallway, her hands clenched at her sides. Through the half-open door, she caught fragments of their voices, hers low and coaxing, his steady but strained. She knew she should not listen, but the sound drew her like a moth to flame. When she finally stepped away, her chest felt hollow. She returned to her duties, moving through the house in silence, yet every room seemed to echo with that woman's laughter. That night, Lawrence sat alone in his study long after the candles had burned low. The storm of emotion Imogen's presence had stirred within him refused to quiet. Memories, long sealed away, rose like ghosts. Her perfume, her letters, the sound of her voice whispering promises she had never meant to keep. But another voice lingered too, softer and far more recent. "You are not cruel, only wounded." Cecily's words haunted him in the hush between heartbeats. He thought of her eyes, clear and honest, and the warmth of her hand that night by the fire. And suddenly the contrast between the two women stood before him like a mirror, one dazzling, cold and certain, the other quiet, steadfast and true. When dawn came, he found Cecily in the rose garden, gathering the early blooms heavy with dew. She looked up when he approached, startled by his sudden appearance. "My lord," she said, curtsying. "Miss Fairley," he greeted, his voice rough from sleepless hours, "I owe you an apology." "For what, my lord?" "For allowing that visit, for letting her voice darken these walls again." "You owe me nothing," she replied. "You were gracious. That is all." "I was not gracious," he said, stepping closer. "I was weak." Cecily shook her head. "If forgiveness makes you weak, then strength must be very lonely." He looked at her, the morning light touching his face, softening the sharp lines of weariness. "You are a strange woman," he said quietly, "because I speak the truth, because you make me want to hear it." For a moment neither moved. The air smelled of roses and rain, the sound of bees murmuring between them. Cecily lowered her gaze, afraid that if she looked at him any longer, the truth of her heart would show too clearly. "I should return to my work," she said at last. "Of course," he murmured. But as she turned away, he added, "Cecily." She froze. It was the first time he had spoken her name without formality, the first time it sounded like something tender. He took a slow breath. "Do not let her trouble you. Her world and mine ended long ago." Cecily's lips parted, but no words came. She only nodded, her throat tight, and walked toward the house. From the terrace, Lawrence watched her go. The wind lifted her apron, carried a lock of hair against her cheek. She moved with quiet grace, unadorned yet luminous in a way that no silks could rival. Behind him, in the distance, he heard the faint roll of another carriage, the sound of departure. Imogen was leaving the Cotswolds, her purpose unfulfilled. But her presence had left behind a tremor, one that neither he nor Cecily could yet name. As the sun climbed higher, painting the manor in gold, Lawrence stood alone among the roses, the scent of them heavy and intoxicating. He closed his eyes and let the warmth touch his face, whispering to himself words he would never dare speak aloud. "She stayed," he murmured. "When everyone else left, she stayed." And though no one heard him, the truth carried on the wind, soft, uncertain, but unbreakable. It was not forgiveness he had found, nor comfort. It was something far more dangerous, the beginning of love. The days that followed Lady Harrowby's departure were heavy with an uneasy calm. The manor seemed quieter, as if the walls themselves listened for something they could not name. Summer ripened fully over the Cotswolds. The orchards glowed beneath sunlight, bees hummed lazily through the air, and wildflowers bent toward the wind in reverent stillness. Yet beneath that beauty, something fragile had begun to fracture. Cecily felt it before she understood it. Lawrence had withdrawn again, though not in anger. His manner toward her was courteous, his words as precise as ever, but the warmth that had begun to flicker between them seemed veiled behind new restraint. He no longer sought her company with quiet excuses, no longer lingered in rooms after she finished her tasks. The distance was not spoken, but it grew with every passing day. She told herself it was right, that she had been foolish to believe kindness might bridge the world between them. He was a marquis, bound by the iron threads of rank and duty. She was a servant, a woman whose life belonged to modest corners and invisible devotion. What had she expected? That he would look at her as an equal, that gratitude could become affection? Still, the ache of it followed her through the mornings and into restless nights. She avoided his eyes now, though every sound of his voice sent her pulse trembling. When she passed him in the hall, her heart lifted and broke in the same instant. One morning, as she polished the silver in the drawing-room, Mrs. Bracken entered with a worried expression. "Have you noticed, Miss Fairley, how pale he's become again?" Cecily's hand stilled. The Marquis. The housekeeper nodded. He doesn't eat, barely sleeps, and the steward says he's refused company. I hoped Lady Harrowby's visit would lay the ghosts of the past to rest, but it seems to have roused them. Cecily swallowed hard. Perhaps solitude is what he needs. Or perhaps it's what he fears most, Mrs. Bracken said quietly, then left her to the silence. That evening, Cecily carried a tray to the library. Lawrence sat by the fire, though the night was mild. His cane rested beside him. An untouched glass of wine glimmered in the lamplight. He looked up as she entered, and their eyes met for the first time in days. "Miss Fairley," he said evenly, "you needn't trouble yourself with these late hours. Leave the tray and go. I prefer to make certain you've eaten, my lord." "I have not." Her tone softened. "Then may I persuade you to begin?" He regarded her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Why do you insist on such small mercies?" "Because they matter." He exhaled a quiet, humorless breath. "You don't understand, Cecily. Sometimes kindness feels more like punishment." She hesitated, the sound of her name on his lips cutting deeper than reproach. "Then forgive me, my lord. I had no wish to cause pain." "You never cause pain," he said. "You only make me remember what peace once felt like." She looked at him then, and the silence between them became unbearable. For a moment, she thought he might say more, but instead, he turned toward the window, where the night pressed against the glass. "Go now," he murmured. "Please." Her throat tightened, but she obeyed. As she closed the door behind her, she heard the faint sound of his cane striking the hearth, a sharp, restrained echo of anger aimed only at himself. The following day, the tension in the household thickened. Rumors had begun to drift from the village. Subtle, poisonous things. Someone had seen the Marquis walking with his maid in the orchard. Someone else claimed she had spent nights tending to him during his illness. A gentleman could recover his reputation. A woman of her station could not. Mrs. Bracken heard the whispers first and sought Cecily in the scullery. "You must take care," she warned. "The world is cruel to those it deems beneath notice. A single word from the wrong lips can undo everything." Cecily felt her cheeks flush. "I have done nothing wrong. Truth doesn't matter to gossip. It never has." That afternoon, when Lawrence found her arranging flowers in the entrance hall, he spoke in a voice lower than usual. "You've heard, I presume." "Yes, my lord," she said quietly. His expression darkened. "I will see that it ends. I'll dismiss whoever began it." "Please don't," she said quickly. "It will only draw more attention. Let the village talk. Words fade when no one listens." He shook his head. "No, Cecily. They fade for me, not for you." Their eyes met. In that look lay everything neither dared to speak, the fear, the longing, the fragile thread of something that might have been happiness. He turned away first. "You should take a few days' rest," he said. "Visit your family if you wish. I'll see to your wages in full." It was a dismissal disguised as kindness, and Cecily felt the sting of it like betrayal. "You wish me gone," she said softly. "I wish you safe," he answered. The restraint in his tone only deepened the ache in her chest. "Then it seems safety and happiness rarely live in the same house." She curtsied and left before he could answer. That evening, the sky turned crimson over the hills. Cecily wandered the gardens alone, her heart heavy with confusion. The scent of roses filled the air, mingled with the hum of summer insects. Beyond the hedgerow, the fields shimmered beneath the fading sun, and she thought of the day they had walked together for the first time, the pride in his stride, the light that had returned to his face. Now that light seemed to flicker again. She could feel him slipping back into the solitude she had once broken, and she, powerless to stop it, could only watch from the edges of his world. When she returned to her room, she found an envelope beneath her door. The handwriting was elegant, the seal unmarked. Inside was a short note. "Forgive my distance. It is not indifference. It is fear. L.A." Cecily read it twice, her fingers trembling. Then she folded the paper carefully and placed it beneath her pillow, the words echoing through her mind long after the candles were out. The next morning, Lawrence rose early and walked to the stables. The sky was grey with approaching rain, the air heavy with the scent of hay and leather. The stable hand hurried to saddle his horse, but Lawrence waved him away. He only wanted to see the animal, to feel the steady breath of something that did not question his worth. He was there when Cecily appeared at the gate, her cloak pulled tight against the wind. "My lord," she called softly. He turned, startled. "You shouldn't be out in this weather. I needed to speak with you." The wind caught her hair, lifting it across her face. She brushed it back, her eyes bright with determination. "If you send me away, let it be because I've failed you, not because the world has decided my presence is improper." He looked at her helplessly, torn between admiration and despair. "Cecily, you don't understand what they'll say." "I understand perfectly," she said. "They'll say a servant forgot her place, but perhaps it was her master who forgot his heart." The words struck him like lightning. For a long moment neither spoke. Rain began to fall, soft at first, then heavier. She stood before him, drenched, unflinching, her gaze locked on his. "You think this is easy for me?" he asked, his voice breaking. "You think I don't feel it every time I see you, this pull, this impossible thing?" "Then stop fighting it," she whispered. He stepped closer, close enough to see the raindrops trembling on her lashes. "If I were a lesser man, I would, and if you were a braver one." He drew in a sharp breath, his hand lifting as if to touch her, then falling again. "Then I would ask you to stay." Cecily's heart beat wildly, but she said nothing. The rain fell harder, soaking her dress, plastering it to her skin. The world seemed to narrow to the space between them, to the sound of breath and storm. At last, Lawrence turned away. "Go inside, Cecily," he said hoarsely, "before the cold takes you." She obeyed, though every step felt like a tear in her heart. When she reached the doorway, she looked back once. He stood in the rain, motionless, his shoulders bowed under the weight of his own restraint. That night, neither of them slept. Cecily sat by the small window in her room, watching lightning ripple across the hills. She pressed her fingers to the glass, remembering the warmth of his voice, the way he had said her name as though it belonged to him. She wanted to believe there was hope beyond this pain, but hope felt dangerous now, a flame too near to kindling. In his chamber, Lawrence paced the floor, the note she had received mirrored by another in his hand. He had written the words out of cowardice, not courage. Fear, as he'd confessed, fear of scandal, of disgrace, of the world that would sneer at what neither of them could deny. Yet in the silence between thunder, another truth rose within him. He had never felt more alive than in her presence. And perhaps, he thought bitterly, the world's scorn was a smaller price than a lifetime of emptiness. When dawn came, the storm had passed, leaving the hills washed clean and gleaming under pale light. The manor awoke slowly, the servants returning to their work, unaware of the quiet war waged in their master's heart. Cecily descended to the kitchen, her face composed, though her hands trembled slightly. The fire crackled, the smell of baking bread filling the air. Mrs. Bracken looked at her from across the room, her eyes kind, but knowing. "Did you sleep at all?" the older woman asked. Cecily smiled faintly. "Enough to dream." "And was it a good dream?" "It was too real for that," she whispered. Outside, Lawrence stood by the terrace, the early sun glinting off his cane. The garden spread before him in all its summer brilliance, roses opening to the morning, dew shining on the leaves. And though he told himself to turn back inside, his gaze lifted toward the servants' wing, where one small window caught the light. He stared at it for a long time, his heart unsteady, knowing that whatever distance he tried to keep was already broken by something stronger than pride, something that no scandal, no whisper, no fear could truly silence. And for the first time in years, he smiled, not in triumph or peace, but in surrender. The evening began in stillness. A fine mist had settled over the hills, softening every line of the Cotswolds landscape. The manor's windows glowed faintly against the grey dusk, their light trembling like the fragile hope that had come to live within its walls. Inside, every sound seemed hushed, as though the air itself waited for something, an answer, a confession, a moment too long delayed. Cecily stood in her small chamber, her apron folded neatly beside her. On the table lay the letter Lawrence had written days ago, the one she had read until the ink seemed to breathe. Forgive my distance. It is not indifference. It is fear. She traced the words once more, her fingers light, her heart heavy. She knew that fear well, the fear of wanting what one had no right to want. A knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Bracken entered, her face more solemn than usual. "The Marquis has guests tonight," she said. "Gentlemen from the county. He wishes the drawing-room arranged and supper served at 9. Cecily nodded. "Of course, ma'am." As she descended the stairs, she told herself it would be an ordinary night. She would light candles, pour wine, and remain unseen, nothing more. Yet some quiet instinct warned her that this evening would not end as quietly as it began. By the time the guests arrived, the storm had begun to gather again over the hills. Distant thunder rolled like the memory of a warning. The drawing-room gleamed with lamplight and polished silver, the scent of wine and roast mingling with that of the summer rain. Lawrence greeted his visitors with measured civility. There were 3 of them: Sir Alistair Harrowby, Lady Imogen's brother, along with 2 neighbouring landowners, both loud and careless men who filled the room with laughter too coarse for its grandeur. Lawrence endured their conversation as one might endure a wound reopened. "Good to see you on your feet again, Ashcombe," Sir Alistair said, his tone polite but edged. "Rumour had it you'd gone quite mad in your solitude." Lawrence's smile was thin. "I find solitude less taxing than gossip, Sir Alistair." The man's eyes gleamed. "Perhaps, though gossip has a curious way of finding its mark. My sister tells me your household has become rather lively of late." The room stilled slightly, though the laughter continued in smaller circles. Lawrence's fingers tightened around his glass. "Your sister's imagination is as generous as ever." "Imagination," Alistair drawled, "or observation." Before Lawrence could reply, Cecily entered quietly with the decanter. The shift in the air was immediate. The men turned to look at her, the simple dress, the calm grace of her movements, the poise that made her seem both present and untouchable. Sir Alistair's smile sharpened. "So this must be the source of such chatter," he said lightly. "A charming servant, my lord. You do have a talent for finding rare things in unlikely places." Cecily's hands trembled slightly as she poured the wine, but her face remained composed. Lawrence rose from his chair, his voice low but cold. "You will speak of her with respect, Harrowby." Alistair's smile did not fade. "I meant no insult, but the village speaks, you see. It wonders what sort of devotion keeps a Marquis company in his exile." Lawrence's jaw tightened. "I will not hear another word." "Then silence your village, not me," Alistair said, his tone dripping false civility. "If you care for your reputation or hers, you would do well to remember your station." Cecily set the decanter down carefully, the sound of glass on silver sharp as a blade. "Please, my lord," she said quietly, "it isn't worth—" But Lawrence's temper broke before she could finish. He stepped forward, his cane striking the floor with controlled fury. "You insult what you cannot comprehend, Harrowby. That is the luxury of small men who mistake cruelty for cleverness." A tense silence followed. The other guests shifted uneasily, uncertain whether to stay or leave. Finally, Alistair laughed, though the sound carried more malice than amusement. "I see exile hasn't improved your manners." Lawrence's eyes burned with restrained fury. "Get out." Alistair rose slowly. "Very well, Ashcombe, but the world won't forget what it suspects so easily. You may yet learn that scandal spreads faster than virtue." He left without another word, the other men trailing behind him, muttering excuses. The door closed, and the house fell silent once more. Cecily stood frozen by the sideboard, her breath shallow. Lawrence's shoulders heaved. As he turned away from the door, the storm inside him echoing the one now raging beyond the walls. "My lord," she began softly, "you shouldn't have— Don't tell me what I should or shouldn't have done," he said, his voice unsteady. "I will not stand by while anyone speaks of you that way." Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from the force of emotion. "And what of what they'll say now? You've only confirmed their whispers." "I don't care what they say," he shouted, then caught himself, the echo of his own words filling the room. His tone broke into something raw. "Do you not see? It was never about them. It was about you." The fire crackled, the rain hammered against the windows. Cecily took a slow step toward him. "About me?" "Yes," he said hoarsely. "You, Cecily. You and your quiet strength. You who make this cursed house feel alive again. You who look at me as if I am still a man worth seeing." She froze, her heart pounding. "My lord." "No," he said, shaking his head. "No more titles, not here, not now." Indeed, for a moment the world outside disappeared, the storm, the whispers, the ruin that might come. There was only the space between them, filled with everything they had fought to suppress. Cecily's voice was barely a whisper. "You can't mean this." "I have meant nothing else since the day you walked into my silence." He took a step closer, the lamplight catching the lines of his face, the anguish, the longing, the fear. "You ask what the world will say. Let it say what it must. I've lived half a life trying to please its cold regard. I'll not die trying to appease it." Her hands trembled, her breath shallow. "You'll ruin yourself." "If ruin is the price of truth, then I will pay it," he said, his voice steady now. For a long, fragile moment, they stood facing each other, neither daring to move. The rain outside softened into a rhythm that matched the sound of their hearts. Cecily wanted to speak, to stop him, to surrender. She didn't know which. When she finally found her voice, it was softer than the rain. "You don't know what you're saying." "I've never known anything so clearly," he replied. "Every morning since you came, I have remembered how to live. Every word you speak reminds me that I am not broken, not yet. Don't ask me to pretend otherwise." She looked at him, tears shining in her eyes, but she did not weep. "What you feel, my lord, is gratitude, not love." His gaze deepened. "Gratitude fades, Cecily. This will not." The sound of thunder rolled through the valley, shaking the glass panes. Cecily turned away, her hands pressed to her heart. "Please," she whispered, "don't say more." "I must," he said softly, "because if I don't, you'll keep believing I fear you. And I don't. I fear only myself, what I become when I look at you." Her breath caught. "And what is that?" He took a step closer, his voice trembling but resolute. "A man who wants to be worthy of the woman he loves." The words broke through her like light through storm clouds. She turned, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. "You mustn't say that," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "It's already said." For a moment, the world was still. The rain eased, the fire burned low, and time seemed to pause between one heartbeat and the next. Cecily met his gaze, her own full of tenderness and terror. "My lord," she said softly, "you mustn't call this love. It cannot be." "Then call it what you will," he murmured. "It remains." They stood there, the distance between them no longer measured in steps, but in the fragile tension of what could never be spoken again. Cecily's hand trembled as she brushed a strand of hair from her face. He reached out instinctively, his fingers almost touching hers before he stopped himself. The restraint between them burned brighter than any flame. At last, she drew a trembling breath. "You should rest," she said, her voice gentle, breaking the spell. "Tomorrow will bring clarity." "Tomorrow," he repeated as if testing the word. "If it comes at all." Cecily turned toward the door, afraid to stay, afraid to leave. She paused once, looking back over her shoulder. Their eyes met one last time, hers filled with quiet anguish, his with the desperate tenderness of a man who had found light only to lose it. When she slipped from the room, the silence that followed felt absolute. Lawrence stood alone in the glow of the dying fire, his heart unsteady but unbroken. Outside, the storm drifted east, leaving the world washed clean. He leaned against his cane, eyes fixed on the door where she had vanished, and whispered into the emptiness, "If love is a sin, then let it be my redemption." And upstairs, in the small chamber at the far end of the corridor, Cecily knelt by her window, watching the clouds part over the valley. The moon emerged, pale and trembling, casting light across the orchard where they had once walked together. She pressed her hand to her lips as though the memory of his words still lingered there. The house was still, utterly still, but in that stillness, two hearts beat with the same impossible rhythm, bound by silence, distance, and the dangerous mercy of love unspoken. Autumn came quietly to the Cotswolds, soft and golden, painting the hills with light the color of honey and copper. The orchards bowed under the weight of ripened fruit. The mornings arrived cloaked in silver mist, and the scent of rain lingered even when the sky was clear. But within Ashcombe Manor, warmth had given way to silence once more, a silence too heavy, too deliberate, as if the house itself held its breath. Cecily moved through her duties with careful precision, but her heart no longer followed the rhythm of her hands. The memory of that night, the confession that had fallen between them like fire, still echoed in every corridor. She had tried to banish his words, to bury them under the armor of obedience, yet they returned again and again, as vivid as the sound of his voice. A man who wants to be worthy of the woman he loves. She told herself it had been madness, a moment of weakness, a fevered confession spoken under the storm's spell. But the way he had looked at her, steadily, as if she were the only soul in the world who could see him, had burned too deeply to forget. Now, each morning, she rose before dawn, worked in silence, and kept to the corners where he would not pass. If their paths crossed by chance, she curtsied with composure, her voice steady, her heart breaking. Lawrence returned the same restraint, though his gaze lingered on her a fraction longer than propriety allowed. The distance between them was a wound neither dared to tend. One grey afternoon, while arranging the library shelves, Cecily found an envelope tucked between the pages of a worn book of poetry. The handwriting on the front was his, her name, Miss Cecily Fairley. Her breath caught. She looked around, but the room was empty, the air still. Her hands trembled as she opened it. "You once told me that kindness was not weakness, but courage. I find I cannot live by that courage without breaking something sacred between us. I have wronged you, Cecily, not with words, but with feeling. I have made you the mirror in which I see my own soul, unworthy, restless, alive. For that, I must beg forgiveness. I will leave Ashcombe before winter. Until then, I ask only that you do not look at me with pity. I could endure your silence, but not your mercy. L." Her eyes blurred. The paper slipped from her hands and landed softly on the carpet. She pressed her palms against her face, the sound of her own heartbeat filling her ears. He was leaving. That night, rain returned to the hills, a steady whisper against the windows. Cecily sat by her small desk, a candle flickering beside her. The house slept, but her thoughts refused to quiet. The letter lay open before her. She took a fresh sheet of paper and began to write. "My lord," she began, but then stopped. The words felt wrong. She tried again. "Lawrence." Her hand shook, the ink pooling at the curve of the L. She wrote through tears she refused to wipe away. "You ask for forgiveness, yet I have none to give, because you have not wronged me. What I feel for you is not shame nor sorrow, but something I cannot name without trembling. If you must go, then go knowing that I have loved you in silence, not for your title, not for your kindness, but for the way you looked at me as if I belonged nowhere else but in your sight." When she finished, she folded the letter and sealed it, her heart pounding with every breath. She meant to burn it at once, to destroy the confession before dawn, but exhaustion overtook her. She set it on the edge of her desk and fell asleep, her cheek resting against her folded arms. By morning, the letter was gone. Panic struck her the moment she saw the empty space. She tore through her room, checking every surface, every drawer. It was nowhere. Someone had taken it. Downstairs, the house hummed with quiet activity. Mrs. Bracken supervised the preparation of breakfast. The steward carried correspondence to the study. Cecily's gaze darted toward the polished oak desk by the window, where Lawrence sat reading the morning letters. Her heart froze. He was holding her letter. For a moment the world seemed to tilt. She wanted to flee, to disappear, but her legs refused to move. Lawrence's expression was unreadable as his eyes scanned the page. When he looked up, his gaze found hers instantly. The silence between them stretched taut, too fragile to bear sound. At last, he rose and dismissed the steward with a quiet word. When they were alone, he said softly, "Come here." Cecily hesitated. "Please," he added, the word gentler now. She crossed the room slowly, her hands clasped tightly before her. He held the letter between two fingers, the paper slightly crumpled from where his hand had trembled. "Did you mean this?" he asked, his voice low. She tried to speak, but no sound came. Her lips parted, then closed again. At last, she whispered, "It was not meant to be read." "But it was written," he said quietly, "and written truth does not vanish by fire or shame." Her cheeks burned. "You were never meant to see it." He stepped closer, his gaze searching hers. "Then why does every word of it feel like something I've been waiting my whole life to hear?" She shook her head, tears welling. "Because you wish it to be true. Because it is true," he said, his voice trembling with conviction. "Cecily, I meant to leave. I thought it was the only way to protect you from what this world would make of us. But this," he lifted the letter, "this has undone every reason I had for going." Her tears fell freely now. "You cannot stay. The world will not forgive what it cannot understand." "Then let it condemn me," he said fiercely. "I have lived by the world's mercy long enough. I want no part of it if it means losing you." She looked at him through the blur of tears. "You would destroy yourself for me." He reached out, his hand hovering near her face, afraid to touch, afraid not to. "No, for the first time, I would save myself." Her breath caught. The air between them shimmered with the tension of everything unsaid, the longing, the fear, the fragile hope trembling between them. "Lawrence," she whispered, his name a prayer. His eyes softened, filled with something so raw it hurt to meet. "Say it again." She did. "Lawrence." He closed his eyes, the sound breaking something open inside him. When he looked at her again, his voice was quiet but sure. "I will not leave Ashcombe. Not while you're here. Not while there's still breath in me." Cecily trembled. "You cannot mean this." "I do. But what will become of us?" He smiled faintly, though sorrow glimmered in his eyes. "Perhaps nothing. Perhaps everything. But whatever comes, I would rather face it beside you than live another day behind walls built from fear." The wind rattled the windows, scattering a few leaves across the terrace outside. Cecily felt her heart beating in rhythm with the storm. "You make it sound simple," she murmured. "Nothing worth having is simple," he said, "but it is honest." She turned away, unable to bear the weight of his gaze. "And what of the letter, my lord?" He lifted it gently. "I will keep it. Not as proof, but as reminder of the moment you taught me courage." Cecily's eyes glistened. "Then I am lost." He shook his head. "No, we are found." For a long time neither spoke. The rain began again, soft and steady, tapping against the windows like the beating of distant wings. Lawrence moved closer until his presence seemed to envelop her. The scent of rain on his coat, the warmth of his nearness, the trembling calm in his breath. "Do you know," he said softly, "what this house has been since you came?" She looked up, her voice a whisper. "What, my lord?" "A place where silence no longer feels like death." Cecily's lips parted, but words failed her. The world seemed to fade around them, the firelight flickering gold, the shadows deepening, the storm's rhythm steady and slow. The distance between them was no longer vast, only fragile, as if one step might break the spell or complete it. He reached for her hand. She did not pull away. Their fingers brushed, tentative, reverent. The touch was nothing and everything, more confession than the letter, more promise than words could ever carry. Cecily closed her eyes. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel it. The impossible, the forbidden, the truth that had waited too long in silence. When she opened them again, he was still watching her, his grey eyes soft with devotion and fear and something deeper than both. She drew a slow breath. "What happens now?" He smiled faintly, his voice low. "Now the world will call me a fool, and for once I will agree." She almost laughed, though tears clung to her lashes. "You are impossible. Then we are alike," he said. Outside, the rain softened to mist. Inside, the fire burned low but steady, its glow warm against the polished floor. The manor, which had held its breath for so long, seemed at last to exhale. Later, when Cecily returned to her chamber, she found her reflection in the darkened glass of the window. The orchard beyond lay silver under the moonlight, the air fragrant with wet leaves and distant thunder. She pressed her hand to her heart, feeling it beat wildly beneath her palm. She knew the world would never understand, that tomorrow might bring ruin, separation, despair. But for the first time in her life, she did not care. Because somewhere in the great quiet house, a man who had once been lost to sorrow had chosen to stay, and the letter she had never meant to send had become the truth that bound them both. Morning arrived in the Cotswolds, as if the world had been washed and made new. A pale sun lifted itself through the last of the mist, turning the hedgerows into silver lace and the fields into quiet sheets of gold. The orchard beyond Ashcombe Manor stood damp and shining, each leaf catching light like a vow that refused to be hidden. Inside the manor, however, peace did not come so easily. Peace never arrived in a house where love had finally spoken its name. Lawrence Ashcombe stood at the window of his study, one hand resting on the cane he had once despised, the other pressed to the cold glass as if he could steady himself against the day ahead. The fire in the hearth had been lit, yet he felt no warmth, not because his heart was cold, but because it was alive, too alive, and life demanded choices. On the desk lay what remained of the quiet war that had been fought behind velvet curtains. Letters, receipts, a folded page torn from a ledger, and a small sealed envelope containing Cecily's confession. He had not opened it again since the moment he read it, not because he feared its contents, but because he feared what it made him capable of. Courage. A knock sounded at the door. "Enter," he said. The steward stepped in, his posture careful, his eyes lowered. "My lord, the vicar has arrived at the gate as you requested." Lawrence nodded once. "Send him in, and see that no one interrupts us." When the steward left, Lawrence exhaled slowly. He had lived too long, allowing other men's whispers to shape his life. That ended today. Reverend Crowthorne entered moments later, rain damp from the morning air, his expression kind and attentive. "My lord, you asked for me early." "I did," Lawrence said, "because I intend to do something the village will not understand, and I would rather the first voice to speak of it be one that carries decency." The vicar's gaze sharpened with concern. "Is this about the rumors?" "It is about truth," Lawrence answered, "and truth, as you know, is rarely welcomed as politely as lies." The vicar drew nearer, noticing the scattered papers. "You've been awake all night." "Yes," Lawrence said quietly. "I have spent years waking in the night, Reverend, but tonight was different. Tonight I stopped trying to convince myself that fear is virtue." The vicar's eyes softened. "Then tell me what weighs on you." Lawrence turned from the window and looked him directly in the face. "I am going to protect Cecily fairly, not with hush money and polite avoidance, but with my name." The vicar held his breath for a moment, then nodded slowly. "That is a dangerous course." "It is," Lawrence agreed, "but it is the only honest one left." The vicar's gaze flicked toward the papers again. "And what of these?" Lawrence's jaw tightened. "My accident was called misfortune, a fall, a twist of fate. But there have always been Fractures in the story. He picked up the torn page and held it out. This is from the estate ledger, the months before my fall. Certain payments were made, unusual ones. Coins moving through hands that had no business touching them. The vicar took it carefully, his brow furrowing as he read. A groom's wages, then a sum marked travel allowance. Lawrence's eyes darkened. The groom who rode with us that day, the one who vanished within a fortnight. The vicar looked up. You believe he was paid to disappear? I believe, Lawrence said, voice low, that someone wanted me weakened, not dead, just removed enough that decisions could be made without me. The vicar's expression sobered. There are men in the county who would benefit from your silence. Yes, Lawrence said, and there is one man who has already tasted the pleasure of threatening my household with polite cruelty. The vicar's eyes narrowed. Sir Alistair Harrowby. Lawrence's mouth tightened. He came with others, drank my wine, and spoke of Cecily as if she were entertainment. He thought he could draw blood without consequence, but he revealed something in that arrogance, how little he fears me. And why would he fear you? The vicar murmured, unless he had reason to believe you might pursue questions that should remain buried. Lawrence's gaze hardened, a cold clarity settling in his chest. He had not wanted to name it, not even to himself. Yet the pieces had begun to fit. Sir Alistair's venom, Lady Imogen's sudden return, the old whispers of wages, the missing ledger page, the groom's vanishing. He leaned both hands against the desk. I will not accuse without proof, but I will not remain blind because proof is inconvenient. The vicar set the page down gently. Then you must proceed carefully, my lord. Quietly. The world protects its own. Lawrence lifted his head, his voice steady. So will I. The vicar watched him for a long beat. And Cecily, does she know what you intend? Lawrence's eyes softened at her name, and something in his face eased. She knows only that I have chosen to stop retreating. The vicar nodded. Then speak with her. Not as a marquis commanding a servant, but as a man asking a woman if she is willing to face the storm beside him. Lawrence swallowed. She believes she will ruin me. The vicar's voice gentled. Then show her that ruin is not the same as sacrifice. Sacrifice is chosen. Ruin is imposed. If she loves you, she will not wish to be the thing imposed. The vicar took his leave soon after, promising discretion and counsel. When the door shut behind him, Lawrence remained still, the silence pressing close again. But it did not feel like death. It felt like the pause before a vow. He rang for Mrs. Bracken. The housekeeper entered with her usual composure, though concern lived in her eyes. You asked for me, my lord? Yes, Lawrence said, and I will ask something of you that may offend your sense of order. Mrs. Bracken lifted her chin slightly. My sense of order has survived wars, funerals, and foolish men in love. It will survive this. Lawrence's mouth twitched with the faintest hint of a smile. Send Cecily to the garden terrace. Tell her I will meet her there. And Mrs. Bracken? Yes, my lord? Thank you, he said quietly, for caring for this house, even when its master had forgotten how. Mrs. Bracken's eyes glistened for a moment, but she only nodded, as if she could not afford tenderness. Go on then. Don't keep happiness waiting, my lord. It has a habit of walking away when it is ignored. When Cecily stepped onto the terrace, the air caught in her throat. The garden stretched before her in late-season beauty. Roses with petals heavy from dew, vines climbing the stone, leaves beginning to bronze at the edges. The light was gentle, forgiving, as if the world itself were trying for once to be kind. Lawrence stood near the balustrade, his coat dark against the pale morning. His cane rested at his side, not as a crutch of shame, but as a companion he no longer cursed. He turned the moment he heard her steps. Cecily curtsied out of habit. My lord. Cecily, he interrupted softly. Not today. Her breath trembled. What is this? It is me, he said, voice low, standing where the village can see me if it chooses, because I am tired of hiding what is true. Her eyes widened, fear and longing colliding in her expression. "You shouldn't." "I should," he replied, "because you have been braver than I deserve." She shook her head. "You read my letter. I never meant—" "I know," he said gently, "and I am grateful it reached me anyway, because it forced me to face my own cowardice." Cecily's voice broke. "The world will destroy you." Lawrence stepped closer, careful as if he approached something sacred. "Listen to me." She did, because his voice had become the only command her heart recognized. "I was injured," he said, "and I was abandoned, not only by Imogen, but by my own faith in myself. I let that abandonment become my identity. Then you arrived, and without fanfare, without demands, you reminded me what dignity feels like." Tears gathered in Cecily's eyes. "I only did my work." "You did far more," he said, and his voice turned fierce with tenderness. "You looked at me without disgust, without pity. You challenged me when everyone else would have whispered behind my back. You made me walk again, not simply on my leg, but in my life." Cecily pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. "Lawrence!" He reached for her hand slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She did not. Their fingers met, warm, steady, reverent. The touch carried no impropriety, only truth. The kind of touch that says, "Without words, I am here. I am not leaving." "I am going to do two things today," Lawrence said. Cecily's eyes searched his. "What things?" "First," he said, "I will make it known that you are under my protection, and that anyone who speaks against your character speaks against mine." Her breath caught. "They will say you've been bewitched." "Let them," he said. "A man who has been dead inside for a year and has learned to breathe again ought to be forgiven for seeming enchanted." A shaky laugh escaped her through tears, and it sounded like sunlight. "And second," he continued, voice lowering, "I will ask you a question as a man, not as a marquis." Cecily's entire body went still. He lifted her hand slightly, his thumb brushing the back of her fingers with a tenderness that made her knees weak. "Will you stay? Not as my servant, not as a sacrifice, but as the woman I choose, freely, stubbornly, shamelessly, every day I'm allowed to wake." The world fell away. Cecily could hear only the rush of her own blood, the distant song of a bird, the quiet breath of the man before her. "You don't know what you're asking," she whispered. "I know exactly," he answered. "I am asking you to let me love you with honor." Her tears slipped down her cheeks, and she did not wipe them away. "And what will become of me?" Lawrence's eyes softened until they nearly broke her. "You will become what you already are. Courage. Only now, you will not carry it alone." Cecily's voice trembled, not with doubt, but with the weight of hope. "If I say yes, you must promise me something." "Anything," he said. "Promise you will not hate yourself again," she whispered. "Promise you won't return to that silence and call it safety." Lawrence inhaled, the emotion in his face raw and unguarded. "I promise." Cecily closed her eyes, and when she opened them, something had changed. Fear still lived there, but it no longer ruled. "Yes," she said, barely audible. The word struck Lawrence as if it were thunder and him combined. His hand tightened around hers, not possession, but gratitude so deep it trembled. He did not kiss her. The world was too near, and he would not take from her what he could not yet offer publicly without consequence. Instead, he lifted her hand and pressed it to his chest, just above his heart, as if to let her feel what she had awakened. "Then it begins," he whispered. "It has already begun," Cecily replied, her voice breaking into a soft smile. Footsteps sounded behind them. Mrs. Bracken had stepped onto the terrace, her expression stern as ever, though her eyes shone. She paused, then inclined her head. Not a servant's curtsy, but something closer to blessing. "My lord," she said briskly as if speaking of the weather, "a visitor has arrived at the gate." Lawrence's gaze sharpened, returning to the world with a new steadiness. "Who?" "The solicitor from Oxfordshire," Mrs. Bracken replied. "The one you requested. He says he has information regarding a former groom's whereabouts and records of a wager placed some years ago." Cecily stiffened, confusion flickering in her eyes. Lawrence squeezed her hand once gently. "Not today," he murmured to her, softer. "Today is ours, but the truth will no longer be a shadow in this house." He turned back to Mrs. Bracken. "Show him to the study." Mrs. Bracken nodded and departed. Cecily looked up at Lawrence, the question trembling on her lips, but he answered it before she could ask. "There are things I must set right," he said quietly. "Not only for my sake, for yours, for this house, for the life we mean to build." Her throat tightened. "I'm afraid." "I am too," he admitted, and the honesty made him more intimate than any kiss. "But fear is no longer my master." Cecily's gaze softened, and she reached with her free hand to touch his sleeve, just a small contact, a brush of fabric and warmth. The gesture held more devotion than any grand declaration. They stood together for a moment longer, the manor behind them, the hills before them, the air around them bright with the fragile, stubborn grace of morning. Lawrence lifted her hand again, not to claim but to honor. "Walk with me," he said. Cecily nodded, and they descended the terrace steps side by side. He limped. He always would, but he did not falter. And Cecily did not steady him as a servant might. She walked beside him as an equal would, close enough to share warmth, distant enough to let him keep dignity, brave enough to face the world with him. In the village below, bells began to ring, soft, distant, as if the very Cotswolds had decided to celebrate something it could not yet name. The year was 1829, and autumn had come again to the Cotswolds. The hills, once wild with wind and rumour, now lay calm beneath a sky of amber light. Ashcombe Manor, once a house of silence and scandal, breathed with life, its windows aglow, its halls filled with the music of laughter and the scent of fresh bread cooling on the kitchen hearth. 9 years had passed since the day Lawrence Ashcombe and Cecily Fairley chose courage over fear. The years had not always been gentle nor free of consequence, but they had been theirs, and that, they both agreed, was enough. The garden, once choked with neglect, now stretched in orderly grace. Rows of white roses bordered the terrace where 2 children played, a boy of 7 and a girl of 5, their curls bright in the afternoon sun. The boy was solemn, thoughtful like his father, while the girl laughed with the same unguarded joy her mother had carried in her heart long before she dared to speak it aloud. "Papa," the boy called, waving a wooden sword. "Mama says I'm to practice my bow before supper." Lawrence stood beneath the oak tree, his cane still by his side, though he used it less now. The years had carved lines around his eyes, but time had not diminished him. It had refined him. His once quiet strength had become calm authority, and the tenderness that Cecily had awakened in him had grown into something unshakable. "Then you must obey your mother," he replied, smiling, "for she has never been wrong." Cecily appeared on the terrace, sunlight catching the faint silver in her dark hair. She wore a simple blue gown, her hands dusted with flour from the kitchen. When she saw them, she lifted her skirts slightly and crossed the lawn with the same grace that had once silenced rooms filled with judgment. "You are far too indulgent," she said with a teasing smile as she reached them. "He'll never learn to aim properly if you keep rescuing him from discipline." Lawrence tilted his head. "Then perhaps his mother should teach him to strike true. You've always known how to make your mark." Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, the years between them disappeared. The same quiet fire that had bound them 9 years ago still lived there, tempered now by peace, deepened by all they had endured together. In the village below, time had done its work as well. The scandal that once shadowed Ashcombe's name had long faded, replaced by quiet admiration for the Marquis, who had defied the gossip of his peers to marry a woman without dowry or name. What had begun as curiosity had turned to respect when Lawrence restored the estate, built a school for the tenants' children, and stood as patron for the orphanage Cecily founded in the neighbouring parish. The poor came to know the manor not as a fortress of wealth, but as a house of mercy. And though the gentry had taken longer to forgive, forgiveness had come all the same. Time has a way of softening even the proudest hearts, especially when faced with happiness that refuses to be broken. Lady Imogen Harrowby had not been so fortunate. Her husband's debts ruined her, and the title she had once worn like a crown became a chain. Sir Alistair, stripped of his lands after his schemes were exposed, fled England entirely. His name, once whispered with envy, became a cautionary tale. The old families of Gloucestershire learned at last that cruelty carries its own inheritance. Cecily sometimes pitied them. Lawrence did not, but neither spoke their names anymore. The past had lost its sting. "Come," Cecily said, taking Lawrence's arm. "It's time for supper." They walked back toward the manor, the children running ahead of them, their laughter carrying on the cool breeze. Inside, the fire crackled, and the long dining table, once a symbol of loneliness, now glowed with warmth and life. Mrs. Bracken, older and slower but no less formidable, oversaw the meal from her place by the door. "Don't you dare think of taking that pie before Grace, my lord," she warned the boy, shaking her head. "You may have your father's smile, but you've your mother's mischief." The family burst into laughter. After supper, as twilight deepened, Cecily slipped away to the terrace. The valley spread before her, the same valley where she had once stood in fear and wonder so many years ago. She could still remember the way the air had smelled that night, the faint scent of rain, the sound of his voice breaking the silence. Lawrence joined her quietly, as he always did. He leaned his cane against the wall and took her hand, their fingers fitting together as naturally as breathing. "The children will be asleep soon," he said softly, "and the house will be ours again." She smiled, eyes still fixed on the horizon. "Do you remember the storm?" He nodded. "Every moment of it. And the letter I never meant to send?" He smiled faintly. "The letter that changed everything." Cecily turned to him, her voice low and warm. "Sometimes I wonder what would have become of us if you hadn't found it." "I would have found you anyway," he said simply. "Some truths do not wait for letters. They find their way through every silence." The wind lifted her hair, brushing it against his cheek. He reached up, tucking a stray lock behind her ear. His hand lingered there for a moment, tracing the curve of her jaw, as if still in awe that she was real. "You've changed me," he murmured. Cecily shook her head. "You changed yourself. I only reminded you what it meant to live." He looked at her for a long moment before speaking again. "Do you ever regret it? The cost?" Her gaze softened. "Love always has a cost, Lawrence. But so does fear, and I have lived both. I would choose love every time." He drew her closer then, until her head rested against his chest and his arm wrapped around her shoulders. They stood like that, two souls tempered by time, listening to the quiet heartbeat of a house that had once known nothing but loneliness. Below, the orchard swayed in the wind, heavy with fruit. The same trees that had witnessed their sorrow now bloomed year after year, stubborn in their renewal. The moon rose, silver and whole. The air smelled of earth and rain and memory. "Look," Cecily whispered, pointing toward the hills. "Do you see it? The lights from the village?" He followed her gaze. The glow of lamps flickered in the distance, warm and constant. "Yes," he said. "They used to make me feel trapped. Now they make me feel home." Cecily smiled. "That's because we no longer hide from the world. We live in it." He pressed a kiss to her forehead, slow and reverent. "9 years," he murmured, "and I still wake every morning astonished that you are beside me." "Then you must promise," she whispered, "to never grow used to it." "Never," he said. The church bells rang faintly from the valley below, their sound soft as prayer. In that moment, Cecily closed her eyes and let the years wash through her. The fear, the scandal, the tears, the laughter, the endless labor of building something that lasted not in grandeur, but in grace. They had not conquered the world, they had only conquered themselves, and that, she thought, was the truest triumph of the heart. Lawrence's hand found hers again. "Shall we go inside?" "In a moment," she said. "I want to remember this light." They stood together as the last of the sun disappeared, wrapped in quiet and the scent of roses. The wind carried the faint echo of children's laughter through the windows, mingling with the low hum of the fire inside. And when night finally came, Ashcombe Manor did not stand in silence as it once had. It breathed with life, with legacy, with the enduring truth that love, once chosen, does not fade with time. It only deepens, root by root, like the roses that grew wild and white along its terrace walls, blooming faithfully each autumn for as long as the valley could remember. As we come to the end of this journey through Ashcombe Manor and the lives of Cecily and Lawrence, it's hard not to feel the weight of the love, the sacrifices and the triumphs that have shaped their path. From the shadows of silence to the light of honesty, their story is a reminder that love, in its purest form, does not seek perfection. It seeks understanding, patience, and courage in the face of adversity. Through the highs and lows, they've shown us that even in the most difficult of times, it is the willingness to choose each other that makes a love unbreakable. It's not about avoiding the storms, but about standing together through them. And while the world around them may have been unkind, they created their own sanctuary, one built on trust, kindness, and the unwavering belief that, even when it feels like everything is falling apart, love will always find a way to heal. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What did you think of their story? What part of their journey touched your heart the most? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you've stayed with us until the very end, please leave the word courage in your comment to let us know. It's a word that speaks to every moment they fought for their love. And if you've found something meaningful in this story, please consider supporting the team that brings these tales to life by sending a super thanks with whatever amount you can or feel moved to give. Your support helps us continue creating the stories you love. If that's not possible right now, no worries at all. You can still support us by sharing this video with your friends, family, or anyone who would appreciate a beautiful, heartfelt story like this one. Don't forget to explore other stories similar to this one by checking out the cards I'm leaving on the screen now. More journeys, more love, and more characters waiting to capture your heart. Thank you so much for being a part of this, for watching, and for letting the power of love in all its forms guide you through these moments. Your presence here makes this all possible, and we couldn't be more grateful. Until next time, remember, love is always worth the fight.